The world had shrunk to the taste of dust and the smell of black powder. 1886, the Wyoming Territory was a raw, open wound on the map of the West, a place where the relentless wind seemed determined to scour away not just the topsoil, but the very distinction between progress and destruction. For Josiah Croft, a rancher whose land stood in the path of Thaddeus Thorne's Union Pacific Railroad, the world was the worn leather of his saddle and the unending thunder of dynamite. The fight for the Sweetwater Valley had been a slow-motion meat grinder, a brutal acre-by-acre struggle that had eroded the souls of the men who fought it. The railroad baron called it the artery of the nation, the final passage before the continent could be truly conquered. On the other side of that passage, local ranchers, settlers, and the displaced tribes fought a losing battle. Caught in the middle were the Chinese laborers, brought in by the thousands to lay the track, then discarded. They were ghosts in their own lives, hated by the white settlers and exploited by their employers. Wei, the unforgiving leader of the local Tong, had ordered his people to resist, to vanish into the hills, to fight to the last. There was no surrender in their vocabulary. That was the catechism Meiling had learned by heart, a lesson reinforced by the death of her husband, his body broken by a rockslide during a poorly planned blasting operation. He was one ghost among thousands. So when Josiah and his men stumbled upon a hidden encampment in an abandoned silver mine north of his property, they expected only two outcomes: a final, desperate fight with hatchets and improvised weapons, or the grim silence of mass suicide, a horror whispered about in the bunkhouses. What they found instead was a handful of terrified, half-starved Chinese men and a small group of women, their traditional silk tunics tattered and stained with grime and rock dust. Among them was Mai Ling. Her face was a mask of stoic resolve, a stillness she had perfected since her husband's death, but her hands, clenched into tiny fists at her side, betrayed a terror so profound it was almost silent. The stories told in the camps had been clear: the American ranchers were white devils, brutal men who would inflict unspeakable horrors upon captured women before leaving their bodies for the coyotes. Meiling had recited the oaths with her companions, death before Dishonor. Yet when the moment came, when the towering, dust-covered foreigners stormed their sanctuary, rifles held at the ready, the final sharp release of death did not materialize. Instead, there was shouting in a harsh, guttural language, the glint of steel barrels, and then a strange, almost baffling order. The men were separated from the women, and the women were herded towards Josiah's ranch, a few miles south across the rolling sagebrush. No brutality, no leering smiles, just a weary, methodical efficiency. The processing was a blur of confusion. A grizzled old ranch hand, his face a roadmap of sun and hardship, briefly examined them for injuries. They were given a small portion of jerky and water from a clean barrel, the tough, salty meat and cool water a shock to their systems. Then they were led into a large, sturdy barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of hay, horses, and dry wood, and it was there that Mai Ling saw it, a row of simple wooden bunks built against the far wall. They were nothing more than rough-hewn planks with a thin, straw-stuffed mattress and a single coarse wool blanket. To the ranchers, they were standard bunkhouse furniture, a meager comfort in a world of hardship. To Mai Ling, they were an unimaginable luxury. She had spent the last 2 months sleeping on a thin reed mat laid upon the cold, damp earth of the mine floor. The idea of sleeping on an elevated surface, protected from the dirt and the chill, seemed like a dream of a forgotten life. As dusk settled, casting long, eerie shadows across the valley, a new wave of confusion washed over her. The American ranchers, Josiah and his hands, began to file into the same barn. They didn't speak to the Chinese women, barely even looked at them. They simply walked to their own bunks, arranged along the opposite wall, shucked off their dusty boots with groans of relief, and lay down. They were mere feet away. Mai Ling's heart hammered against her ribs. In her culture, the proximity of unmarried women and men, especially a widow to strange men, in a sleeping arrangement was a violation of the deepest codes of conduct. It was a prelude to shame, an invitation to dishonor, a desecration of her husband's memory. She and the other women exchanged fleeting, terrified glances. They were trapped. The devils were all around them. Yet, as the minutes turned into an hour, nothing happened. The only sounds were the distant boom of railroad dynamite, the mournful cry of a coyote, and the soft, steady breathing of the sleeping men. They had simply gone to sleep. They lay on their backs, their hats and gun belts beside their bunks, vulnerable in their exhaustion. They were not monsters in the dark. They were just tired men. This profound, inexplicable disconnect between expectation and reality was more terrifying than any anticipated cruelty. The enemy was supposed to be a caricature of evil, a simple target for hatred. But this quiet, unassuming humanity was a puzzle she could not comprehend. Mai Ling lay stiffly on the strange, yielding surface of the bunk, her body a knot of tension. The wool blanket was rough against her skin. She stared into the oppressive darkness of the barn, her eyes fixed on the silhouetted forms across the narrow aisle. The men she was taught to believe were beasts were sleeping like children. The comfort of the bed felt like a trick, the silence a lie. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Yet the only real battle was the one raging inside her own mind, a war between a lifetime of indoctrination and the bewildering evidence of her own senses. The dawn arrived not with light, but with a change in the cadence of violence. The morning brought the frantic crackle of rifle fire and the sharper explosions of dynamite, closer now. Mai Ling had not slept. The great unspoken terror of the night had dissolved into a grey, anticlimactic morning. The ranchers awoke with the practiced groans of exhausted men. Josiah Croft felt the familiar ache in his lower back as he sat up. His eye scanned the barn, first checking on his own men, and finally on the silent row of Chinese women. He saw the dark circles under their eyes, the rigid way they held themselves. His gaze briefly met Mai Ling's before she quickly looked away, her head bowed. There was a small, festering cut on her hand, which he had noticed yesterday. It needed cleaning. He approached her slowly, holding up a small tin of salve and a clean rag. "It's okay," he said, his voice soft, the tone he reserved for spooked horses. Mai Ling flinched. Josiah stopped, holding his hands out, palms open to show he held no weapon. He pointed to her cut, then to his tin of salve, a simple pantomime of help. After a long, tense moment, she hesitantly extended her hand. His touch was professional and surprisingly gentle. When he was done, he wrapped a clean strip of cloth around her palm. He offered a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, then retreated. Mai Ling stared at the white bandage. It was a stark, clean mark against her dirt-stained skin. Devils did not tend to the wounds of their victims. "Don't get too friendly with them, Josiah," a voice grumbled beside him. It was Hank, a wiry older ranch hand whose face was a permanent mask of suspicion. "My brother was killed by Tong hatchet men building the pass at Donna. They don't deserve our bandages." "She's a woman, Hank." "And that cut could go bad," Josiah replied. "She's one of them," Hank shot back. "I see the way she watches everything. Her eyes ain't scared. They're counting. Counting men, counting rifles." That evening, the routine repeated itself. This time, Mai Ling watched Josiah. She saw him meticulously clean his rifle, his movements patient and deliberate. She saw him sit on the edge of his bunk and pull a worn leather wallet from his vest pocket. He opened it and stared for a long time at a small, creased photograph inside. A flicker of an unfamiliar emotion crossed his face, a deep, painful longing that was so intensely personal, it felt like a secret she had stumbled upon. It was an expression she understood perfectly. It was the look of a person who desperately wanted to be somewhere else with someone else, someone they had lost. The broad, monolithic fear of the white devil was beginning to fracture, replaced by 1,000 smaller, more complex questions about this one man. He was not a monster. He was a rancher who bandaged his enemy's hand and carried a picture of a loved one in his pocket. The logic of the conflict, as she had been taught it, was simple: resist or die. But nothing about this barn was simple. How were you supposed to react to kindness from your sworn enemy? Several days bled into one another. The distant thunder of Thorne's railroad crews was a constant companion. Inside the barn, a fragile, unspoken truce had formed. Hank's suspicion, however, had curdled into a palpable hostility. He watched Mai Ling with a hawk's intensity. The reveal, when it came, was not what he expected. It arrived with a scream and a flash of orange fire. Thorne's men, in a bold move to drive Josiah off his land for good, launched a direct raid on the ranch house and barn at dusk. It was an extermination. Sticks of dynamite arced through the twilight sky. The world dissolved into a cacophony of splintering wood, the terrified shrieks of horses, and the screams of men. The air, thick moments before with hay and sweat, now tasted of burnt powder and iron. Josiah was thrown against a support beam, his head ringing. He scrambled to his feet, a frantic calm descending over him. Men were groaning. One ranch hand lay eerily still. And Daniel, the young ranch hand Josiah had been mentoring, was on the ground, a large dark stain rapidly spreading across his chest from a wound high on his shoulder. In the chaos, Hank scrambled for his rifle, his eyes darting to the Chinese women. On the ground, all of you, he shrieked. To him, this was the moment he had predicted. Josiah saw Daniel and knew it was bad. A wood splinter had acted like shrapnel, severing an artery. Daniel's face was already a ghastly pale white. "I need pressure on Daniel," he yelled over his shoulder to anyone who could hear. But the other able-bodied men were either wounded, in shock, or returning fire. Hank was too busy keeping his rifle aimed at the huddled women. Daniel was bleeding out. Mai Ling saw it all in a series of stark, terrifying snapshots. She saw the pulsing wound on Daniel's shoulder and knew, with the certainty of her limited training, her father in their village had been a healer, that he had only moments to live. The voice of the Tong leader screamed in her head, "The enemy is weak. This is your chance." But another image pushed its way through the panic, Josiah gently bandaging her hand, Josiah looking at the worn photograph in his wallet. Hank bellowed at her again. But Mai Ling was no longer listening to him. She scrambled on her hands and knees, crossing the invisible line that divided the barn. She ignored Hank's rifle, ignored the shouts, and fell to her knees beside the dying young man. Without hesitating, she pressed the heel of her hand directly into the wound, pushing down with all her weight. The gush of hot blood soaked her hands and forearms, shocking in its warmth. She leaned in, her small frame trembling, using her body to apply the desperate, life-saving pressure. The raid ended as suddenly as it began. An unearthly silence descended, punctuated by the whimpers of the wounded. Josiah, having stabilized another man, turned and saw the scene. He froze. The Chinese widow, the quiet prisoner, was covered in an American rancher's blood, her face a mask of intense concentration, her hand saving his man's life. Hank stood over her, his rifle still leveled, his expression a disbelieving wreck of confusion and shock. The lines were gone. There was no American side or Chinese side. There was only the living, the dying, and a single, impossible act of mercy. In the adrenaline-fueled aftermath, Mai Ling became Josiah's silent, efficient deputy. There was no language between them, only the universal syntax of triage. She held a compress on one man's leg while Josiah stitched a deep gash on another. Hank simply stood, his rifle lowered, a statue of obsolete conviction. When the last of the wounded, including a stabilized Daniel, were made as comfortable as possible, Mai Ling finally stood up, her hands and forearms coated in drying blood. She turned to rejoin the other Chinese women, but as she approached, they shrank away from her. One of them whispered the word, "Hanjin, traitor." Her act of mercy was, to them, an act of ultimate betrayal. In saving an enemy's life, she had become an outcast among her own people. Josiah saw the exchange. A few minutes later, he approached her, holding out a bucket and a basin of clean water. He said nothing, simply set it down before her and walked away. The act was louder than any words. As Mai Ling plunged her hands into the cool water, watching the American's blood swirl and dissipate, she felt a strange and terrifying sense of release. She was unmoored, adrift between two worlds, belonging to neither. News of the incident traveled with the speed of frontier gossip. By the next afternoon, it reached Mr. Finch, an agent for Thaddeus Thorne's railroad. He was a man who saw the world as a collection of assets and liabilities. He arrived in a buggy that was conspicuously clean, his suit crisp. "Mr. Croft," Finch began, his tone disarmingly casual. "I understand you have a cooperative asset among the Chinese you're harboring." Mr. Thorne is desperate for information on Wei's main stronghold in the Blackstone Hills. I'm here to ask her a few questions. The interrogation took place in the ranch's main house. Meiling sat on a wooden chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Finch unrolled a topographical map. We know Wei has a command post somewhere in this sector, he said, his finger tapping a grid of canyons. You were with them, miss. Meiling stared at the map, her heart pounding. She knew the place he was pointing to. To give them up would be the final, unforgivable act of betrayal. She looked up, her terrified eyes finding Josiah's. He stood by the doorway, his face grim, powerless. Mr. Finch leaned forward. Young Daniel has a mother and 2 sisters back in Laramie. You saved their son. Help us save more American sons. Tell me where the stronghold is. Her past and her present converged in that single, terrible question. Her mind, a whirlwind of fear and duty, finally found a still point of clarity. It wasn't about choosing a side, it was about choosing a meaning for the blood that was on her hands. She took a slow, steadying breath. I cannot tell you about Wei's stronghold, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet clear and firm. The translator relayed the words. Mr. Finch's expression tightened, but Meiling continued, I can tell you something else. 2 days ago, I overheard a plan to attack a settler wagon train passing through the Aspen Creek Pass. She pointed to a different spot on the map, miles from the Blackstone Hills. It is a trap, meant to provoke the cavalry. And the ones sent to attack are not Tong fighters. They are simple laborious, old men and boys given old rifles, told to make a final stand. Your soldiers will walk into a slaughter for both sides. Finch stared at her, then at the map. The information was specific, tactical, and, if true, incredibly valuable. It was also verifiable. He gave a curt nod. We will look into it. As Josiah walked Meiling back to the barn, he paused. Why? He asked, the single word encompassing 100 questions. Meiling looked at the white cloth still faintly visible on her palm. The men you fight, the Tong, they have chosen their path, she said softly. Those old men and boys, they have not. Your Daniel has a family. Perhaps some of them do, too. No more ghosts. It wasn't a full explanation, but it was the truest one she could offer. 2 days later, a cavalry patrol informed Josiah that they had intercepted a raid at Aspen Creek, disarming the attackers with minimal bloodshed. His final sight of Meiling was the next morning. A wagon had arrived to transfer her and the other women to a federal outpost in Cheyenne. She was being herded on with the others, still an outcast. She saw him standing by the ruined barn, and for a moment their eyes met across the dusty yard. He simply raised his hand in a small, almost imperceptible wave. She responded with a slight bow of her head, a gesture of profound, heartbreaking dignity. Then the wagon's canvas flap fell shut, and she was gone. The fight for the valley raged on. The railroad went through. The war ended. Josiah Croft went on, carrying the ghosts of the men he couldn't save, and the memory of his wife. But in the quiet moments, through all the long years that followed, his mind would return to that barn in the dust. He would remember the impossible choice and the quiet courage of a young widow who, caught between 2 warring worlds, chose to create a small, defiant piece of her own. She had not saved a cause or won a fight, but she had saved a piece of their shared humanity. And in the deafening silence after the last shot was fired, that small echo was the only victory that truly mattered.